Ezekiel Vance and Delphine Vance were bound by blood, but their love was anything but ordinary. In the shadowed halls of the Vance estate, their connection twisted into something forbidden, something dangerous, something that could only end in blood. When Delphine was found brutally murdered in her own home, the scene staged to look like a robbery gone wrong, investigators uncovered a truth far more disturbing than they could have ever imagined. Ezekiel Zeke Vance had always been different from other boys his age. While his peers spent their teenage years chasing fleeting romances and dreaming of the future, Zeke's world revolved around one person, his grandmother, Delphine Vance. To the outside world, their bond seemed normal, even admirable. After all, Delphine had practically raised him after his parents' tragic deaths in a car accident when he was just 14. With no siblings and no immediate family willing to take him in, Delphine had opened the doors of her grand estate in Hollow Creek and given him everything he could ever need. But there was something about their closeness that unsettled those who looked too closely. Delphine was no ordinary grandmother. She had been a beauty in her youth, and even in her late 60s, she carried herself with a grace that made people forget her age. She was wealthy, sophisticated, and possessed an intoxicating charm that left men, young and old, captivated. With striking silver hair always styled to perfection, deep red lipstick framing her knowing smile, and a wardrobe filled with elegant silk dresses, she was the kind of woman who commanded attention. Even Zeke, barely out of boyhood, was no exception to her allure. At first, their relationship was easy to justify. Delphine had taken in a grieving grandson, given him a place to heal, and offered the comfort he so desperately needed. But as time passed, grief turned into something else. Zeke didn't just rely on Delphine, he worshipped her. She was his world, his obsession. He followed her everywhere, learning the way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she made people bend to her will with a single glance. His admiration bordered on devotion, and soon he found himself consumed by thoughts he couldn't explain. People in Hollow Creek whispered about the Vance estate. The mansion itself was a relic of old money. A sprawling Victorian home perched on the edge of town, shrouded in ivy and mystery. It had always been a place of prestige, the site of extravagant parties in Delphine's younger years. But after Zeke moved in, it became something else entirely. The doors that were once open to social gatherings were shut. The laughter of guests no longer echoed through the halls. The staff, once bustling through the estate, began to disappear one by one. At first it was subtle. Delphine let go of the housekeeper who had worked for her for over 20 years, claiming she no longer needed help. Then, the gardener stopped coming, and the chef who prepared her meals was dismissed. By the time Zeke turned 18, the mansion stood nearly empty, its grandeur fading into silence. No one knew why Delphine had suddenly withdrawn from society, but some suspected it had something to do with her grandson. Zeke, once a promising student, abandoned any ambitions for his future. He dropped out of college before completing his first semester, claiming he couldn't bear to be away from his grandmother. He spent his days at the estate, tending to Delphine's every need. If she so much as mentioned a passing thought, how she missed a certain perfume or longed for a particular brand of wine, Zeke made sure it was in her hands within hours. But his devotion didn't stop there. He grew possessive. If Delphine received calls from old friends, Zeke dismissed them before she could answer. If a visitor arrived at the estate, he would turn them away at the door with cold politeness. Slowly, he cut her off from the world, ensuring that he was the only person she had left. Delphine, despite her strong-willed nature, didn't fight him. Maybe she enjoyed the attention, the way Zeke's eyes followed her every move with admiration that bordered on worship. Maybe she was too tired to resist. Or maybe deep down, she knew she had created something she could no longer control. For Years, their strange arrangement continued in secrecy, but love, when twisted into something unnatural, always turns to poison. And what started as obsession would soon spiral into a crime that would shake Hollow Creek to its core. The mansion in Hollow Creek stood in eerie silence, its once vibrant halls now consumed by an atmosphere of isolation. Inside, Ezekiel "Zeke" Vance lived in a world of his own making, one where his grandmother, Delphine Vance, belonged to him and no one else. What had once been an unbreakable familial bond had transformed into something unrecognizable, something dark, unnatural, and dangerous. Delphine had always been a woman of influence, but inside her own home, she had become a figure of quiet compliance. She allowed Zeke to dictate the rules of the estate, to manage the staff, to decide who could come and go. It wasn't that she was weak. Delphine had never been weak. But Zeke's devotion was intoxicating. No one had ever loved her with such singular focus, with such unyielding loyalty. The outside world had never given her that. Lovers had come and gone, friends had faded with time, but Zeke remained. He was the one constant, always there, always watching, always waiting for her approval. At first, their closeness had been something she justified to herself. Zeke had been a lost boy when he came to her, a teenager robbed of his parents, and she had provided him with a home, love, and guidance. But over the years, the lines blurred. It was in the way he looked at her, not as a grandson should, but as a man possessed. It was in the way he spoke to her, his voice thick with emotion, his words laced with something far more than admiration. It was in the way he touched her, a lingering hand on her shoulder, fingers brushing against hers longer than necessary, a closeness that felt suffocating yet irresistible. Zeke had no interest in the world beyond the mansion. He rejected friends, ignored opportunities, and abandoned any hope of a normal life. He had no need for those things, not when he had Delphine. She was his world, his obsession, his reason for existing. He refused to share her, growing jealous of even the faintest distractions. If she so much as mentioned an old acquaintance, his face would darken, his jaw would tighten, his fingers would twitch at his sides. He despised anything that threatened to pull her away from him. Over time, Delphine's life shrank until Zeke was the only thing that remained. He controlled what she read, what she watched, what she did. When she took long baths, he would sit outside the door, waiting. When she napped in the afternoons, he would stand by her bedroom, listening to her steady breathing. When she dressed, for the evening, he would watch her reflection in the mirror, his eyes lingering on her with a hunger he barely concealed. But obsession is never truly satisfied. No matter how much control Zeke had, it was never enough. He wanted to possess her completely, to ensure that no one, not even time, could take her away. He spoke of their bond in whispers, words meant only for her ears, words that made her pulse quicken with both fear and fascination. He told her that they were different, that no one could understand what they had, that their love transcended anything the world would ever accept, and Delphine, for all her wisdom, let it continue. Perhaps it was vanity, the thrill of being adored, with such intensity. Perhaps it was loneliness, the comfort of knowing that someone was always there, always waiting. Or perhaps it was something far more twisted, something she couldn't even admit to herself. Then came the moment when Delphine realized she had gone too far. One evening, as she stood by the grand piano in the drawing room, sipping from a glass of wine, she felt Zeke watching her from across the room. His gaze was unrelenting, his expression unreadable. There was something in his eyes she had never seen before, something beyond obsession, beyond devotion. It was a kind of possession, a silent claim that made her skin prickle with unease. For the first time, she felt afraid. Not of Zeke himself, but of what he might do if she ever tried to leave him behind. And deep down, She knew that moment would come. Their strange world was unsustainable, a house of cards waiting to collapse. She had let it go on for too long, had fed his delusions until they had taken root, until they had grown into something monstrous. She knew then that she would have to end it. But what Delphine failed to realize was that Zeke had already made his decision. If she tried to take herself away from him, he would do whatever it took to keep her, even if it meant spilling blood. The night of Delphine Vance's murder was cold and stormy, as if the universe itself had sensed the horror that was about to unfold within the mansion's walls. The estate had always been quiet, but that night it was suffocatingly still, the kind of silence that only exists before something terrible happens. Rain hammered against the windows, wind howled through the trees, and thunder rumbled in the distance, masking the sound of the chaos inside. Delphine had made her decision. She could no longer ignore the monster she had created, the obsession she had allowed to fester and grow. She sat at her grand mahogany desk in the study, pen trembling slightly in her hand as she wrote a letter to her lawyer. The words were simple but final. She was changing her will. Zeke would inherit nothing. It was the only way to sever the invisible chains that bound them together. If she cut off his lifeline, he would have no choice but to leave. She sealed the letter in an envelope and placed it on her desk, ready to send it in the morning. But she never got the chance. Zeke had seen everything. He had watched from the shadows, his heart pounding as he realized what she was about to do. She was abandoning him, erasing him from her life, casting him aside as if he were nothing. After everything he had given her, after all the sacrifices he had made, she was willing to destroy him. The thought sent a violent tremor through his body. His mind spiraled, filling with rage, fear, and an unbearable sense of betrayal. He couldn't let her do this. He wouldn't let her. With slow, deliberate steps, he entered the study. Delphine looked up, startled, her expression unreadable. Maybe she saw the madness in his eyes. Maybe she knew in that instant that there would be no reasoning with him. The confrontation was brief and brutal. Zeke's hands trembled with fury as he grabbed the letter, his breathing ragged, his eyes wild. He tore the envelope open, scanning. The words his worst fears confirmed. She was cutting him out, destroying him. His vision blurred with rage, his pulse a deafening roar in his ears. Delphine tried to stand, her voice calm but firm, but Zeke was faster. He grabbed the heavy crystal, paperweight from her desk, its sharp edges glinting in the dim light. Before she could react, he swung. The first blow landed on the side of her head with a sickening crack. She staggered backward, knocking over her chair, her hands grasping at the desk for support. Blood splattered across the pristine white papers, staining them crimson. But Zeke wasn't done. A second blow, then a third, then a fourth. By the time he stopped, the study was unrecognizable. Blood pooled on the expensive Persian rug, soaked into the fabric of Delphine's silk robe, splattered across the bookshelves and walls. Her lifeless body lay crumpled beside the desk, eyes wide open, frozen in a final moment of shock. For a long time, Zeke just stood there, staring down at what he had done. His hands were shaking, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The storm outside raged on, lightning flashing through the windows, illuminating the horror before him. Panic set in. He needed a plan. He couldn't let anyone know the truth. If they found out, they would take him away from her forever. He couldn't allow that. He wiped the blood from his hands as best he could and set to work staging the crime scene. He shattered a nearby window with a fireplace poker, making it look like a break-in. He pulled open drawers, scattered jewelry across the floor, and knocked over a lamp. He even took a knife from the kitchen and sliced a shallow wound into his own arm, just enough to sell the story that he had been attacked by an intruder. Once everything was in place, he called the police, his voice trembling as he delivered the performance of his life. "There's been a break-in. My grandmother. She's been murdered." By the time authorities arrived, Zeke was ready. He played the role of the grieving grandson flawlessly, his tears genuine, his pain real, and for a brief moment he believed he might actually get away with it. But what he didn't realize was that the truth always has a way of bleeding through even the most carefully crafted lies. Detective Merrick Holloway arrived at the Vance estate just before dawn, stepping out of his car and into the bitter chill of the early morning air. The mansion loomed before him, its dark silhouette standing against the gray sky. The flashing red and blue lights of the patrol cars illuminated the scene, casting eerie shadows across the wet driveway. The rain had stopped, but the storm had left the air heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else. Something metallic. Blood. The crime scene inside was meticulously arranged, almost too perfectly. Holloway had seen enough crime, scenes in his career to recognize when something wasn't quite right. The supposed break-in was messy, but only in the way someone who had never actually committed a robbery might imagine it. Drawers had been pulled open but not rummaged through. Valuable jewelry lay scattered on the floor, untouched. The window had been shattered, but the glass had fallen outward instead of inward, a telltale sign that it had been broken from the inside. And then there was Ezekiel Vance. Zeke sat on the grand staircase, his head in his hands, his body trembling as an officer placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. His sleeve was rolled up just enough to reveal a fresh wound on his arm, a thin, precise cut. It was the kind of wound that looked painful but wasn't life-threatening. Convenient, Holloway thought. The young man had all the signs of someone who had carefully crafted a story, and yet something about his grief seemed real. Not the grief of a man who had just lost his beloved grandmother, but the grief of someone who had lost control. Holloway knelt beside Delphine's lifeless body, taking in the brutality of the attack. Blood had soaked into the fibers of the Persian rug, its deep red color almost blending in with the intricate patterns. The murder weapon, a crystal paperweight, lay in shards nearby, its once pristine surface now coated in blood. This was not the work of a panicked burglar. This was personal, rage-driven, and whoever had done it had made sure Delphine wouldn't survive. Zeke told his story with careful precision, his voice shaking at all the right moments. He had been asleep, he claimed, when he heard a noise downstairs. He had come down to investigate and had been attacked by a masked intruder. He had fought back, but the intruder had overpowered him, cutting his arm in the struggle before fleeing through the broken window. When he regained consciousness, he found his grandmother dead. It was a compelling story, but it had holes. Too many holes. Holloway could see it in the way Zeke avoided eye contact, the way his hands twitched when asked to repeat certain details. He was hiding something. The detective had been in this game long enough to know when someone was drowning in their own lies. As forensic teams worked through the crime scene, they uncovered the first real clue, a partially burned letter in the fireplace. The edges were charred, but the ink had not completely faded. The words were faint, fragmented, but enough remained to tell a story. Change to the will. Remove Ezekiel. Effective immediately. Holloway felt his pulse quicken. Delphine had planned to cut Zeke out of her will, and now she was dead. The motive was becoming painfully clear. Forensics continued their work, piecing together the puzzle. Blood spatter analysis contradicted Zeke's version of events. The trajectory of the splatter suggested that Delphine had been struck while sitting at her desk, not in the middle of a struggle. The cuts on Zeke's arm were analyzed and found to be shallow, deliberate. Not the kind of wound inflicted by an assailant in a chaotic attack, but the kind that someone might give themselves to sell a story. Then came the final damning piece of evidence. Zeke's fingerprints. They were on the paperweight, not just on the surface, but in places where they shouldn't have been unless he had gripped it tightly, pressed it into flesh. Holloway took a deep breath, glancing at the young man still sitting on the staircase. staring blankly at the floor. He was unraveling, and it was only a matter of time before the weight of the truth crushed him. By the time Zeke was brought in for questioning, the evidence was overwhelming. The detective watched him closely, noting the way his hands clenched into fists, the way his jaw tightened as if he were holding something back. He was losing control, his carefully crafted lies crumbling, and Holloway knew exactly how this would end. It was only a matter of time before Zeke admitted the truth. The interrogation room was cold, sterile, and devoid of comfort. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, casting a dull glow over the pale gray walls. Ezekiel Vance sat motionless in the metal chair, his wrists shackled to the table before him. His once pristine white shirt was stained with blood, his grandmother's blood. His fingers twitched as he stared at them, as if he could still feel the warmth of her life slipping through his hands. Detective Merrick Holloway sat across from him, his presence quiet but heavy. He had seen this before, the way guilt clung to a person like an unshakable weight, the way denial crumbled under the relentless pressure of truth. The evidence was overwhelming. They had the murder weapon. They had Zeke's fingerprints. They had the partially burned letter from Delphine, revealing that she had been planning to disinherit him. They had everything they needed. Zeke had been silent for hours, refusing to speak beyond the initial denials. But the silence couldn't last forever. "It's over," Holloway finally said, his voice calm but firm. "We know the truth, Zeke." Zeke blinked slowly, his gaze unfocused. His mind was a storm, a whirlwind of memories, emotions, and regrets. He had planned it so carefully. He had thought he could control the narrative, that he could spin a tragedy convincing enough to make them believe him. But it hadn't been enough. Holloway leaned forward, studying the young man's face. "You loved her," he continued, his voice softer now, almost understanding. "But not the way a grandson should." Zeke's breath hitched, his entire body going rigid, his fingers curled into tight fists, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to deny it, to spit out another lie, but what was the point? They knew. They all knew. "She was going to leave you behind," Holloway pressed. "She was cutting you out, and you couldn't handle it." The words hit Zeke like a knife to the gut. He clenched his jaw, his teeth grinding together, his vision blurring with unshed tears. "She was everything," he finally whispered, his voice barely audible. "She was all I had." Holloway let the silence stretch between them, giving Zeke the space to speak. The confession was inevitable. It was only a matter of time. "I tried to stop her," Zeke continued, his voice hollow, as if he were speaking from a place far away. "She didn't understand. She thought she could just walk away, like I was nothing." His breathing grew ragged. "I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let her go." His eyes flickered upward, locking onto Holloway's. There was something broken in them, something desperate. "I didn't mean to kill her," he whispered, but the words felt empty even to himself. I needed her to stay." But he had killed her, and there was no taking it back. The confession came in waves, spilling out of him in fragmented sentences, each one heavier than the last. He told them everything: the obsession, the control, the moment he saw the letter that sealed his fate. He described the anger, the betrayal, the way he had lost himself in the violence. The moment the words left his lips, he knew there was no going back. The last thread of the fantasy he had built, the illusion that he could somehow keep Delphine forever, had finally snapped. The trial was swift. The prosecution painted a chilling picture of a young man consumed by obsession, a grandson who had crossed the boundaries of love and descended into madness. The evidence left no room for doubt. Zeke was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Holloway attended the sentencing, watching as Zeke stood before the judge, His face expressionless, his once vibrant eyes now empty. There was no remorse, no pleas for mercy. There was nothing left of the boy who had once idolized his grandmother. As he was led away in chains, Zeke did not struggle. He did not protest. He did not speak. For the rest of his life, he would sit in a cold, gray cell, haunted by the ghost of the only woman he had ever loved. And in the end, she was still beyond his reach.